Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are following the money, because when you follow the money, you always find the story.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Tonight we have three stories that, on the surface, look completely unrelated: an AI company drowning in debt, a new president rewriting the rules in South Korea, and a corruption scandal tearing apart Myanmar's resistance government. But stick with us, because by the end of this broadcast, you're going to see the thread that connects all three.
We're starting tonight with OpenAI, the company that launched ChatGPT, sparked a global AI arms race, and has been burning through cash at a rate that would make a Pentagon contractor blush. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, OpenAI's fundraising boom is finally hitting a wall, and the cracks are starting to show.
And then we'll take you to Seoul, where President Jae-myung is doing something almost unheard of in modern politics, actually keeping his promises and letting the public watch him do it. The Diplomat has a fascinating deep dive on how he's rewriting the playbook for executive power.
And we'll close with a story out of Myanmar that deserves far more attention than it's getting. A corruption scandal inside the National Unity Government, the very organization that's supposed to be fighting for democracy, is raising serious questions about whether the resistance can hold itself together. Let's get to work.
Let's start with the big one. OpenAI, once the darling of Silicon Valley, the company that could seemingly raise money just by snapping its fingers, is now facing a financial reckoning. Al Jazeera is reporting that the company's fundraising momentum has slowed significantly, and experts are openly questioning whether OpenAI has a viable path to profitability.
And let's put some numbers on this, Maya, because the scale of spending here is genuinely staggering. OpenAI reportedly needs tens of billions of dollars just to keep the lights on. We're talking about massive compute costs, the electricity, the server farms, the chips, all of it adds up to an operation that is hemorrhaging money at an extraordinary pace. This is a company that, by multiple estimates, is spending far more than it earns.
Here's what's critical to understand. OpenAI's business model has essentially been raise enormous sums of money, spend it on compute and talent, and promise investors that profits will come eventually. That eventually is doing a lot of heavy lifting. According to the Al Jazeera report, experts have begun to question the AI startup's path forward amid surging financial needs and, crucially, no clear profit plan.
No clear profit plan. Let that sink in. This is a company valued at hundreds of billions of dollars, and the experts, not the critics on social media, the actual financial analysts, are saying there is no clear plan to make money. That's not a startup hiccup. That's a structural problem.
And it gets more complicated when you look at how OpenAI has been raising money. They've gone through multiple funding rounds at escalating valuations, bringing in sovereign wealth funds, tech giants, and institutional investors. But each round comes with expectations. These investors aren't charities. They expect returns. And when the fundraising boom slows, as Al Jazeera reports it now has, the pressure to deliver those returns intensifies dramatically.
Let's talk about the competitive landscape, because OpenAI is no longer the only game in town. When ChatGPT launched, they had a massive first-mover advantage. But now you've got Google with Gemini, Anthropic with Claude, Meta open-sourcing their models, and a wave of Chinese AI companies like DeepSeek putting out competitive models at a fraction of the cost. The moat that OpenAI thought it had is looking more like a puddle.
That's exactly right. And DeepSeek is a perfect example of why the just spend more money approach might not work. DeepSeek demonstrated that you can build highly capable AI models without the astronomical budgets that OpenAI has been burning through. That fundamentally challenges the assumption that whoever spends the most wins the AI race.
So here's the question every investor should be asking: if your competitors can achieve similar results for less money, and your costs keep going up, and you have no clear path to profitability, what exactly are you investing in? Hope. Because hope is not a business model.
And there's a governance angle here too that we can't ignore. OpenAI started as a non-profit with a mission to develop AI safely for the benefit of humanity. Then it created a capped profit subsidiary. Then it pushed to convert to a fully for-profit company. Each of these transitions has been driven, at least in part, by the need to raise more capital. The mission keeps getting reshaped to fit the fundraising requirements.
That's the pattern we keep seeing in Silicon Valley. Start with idealism, scale with investor money, and then watch the original mission get quietly buried under the weight of financial obligations. OpenAI's founding charter talked about ensuring AI benefits all of humanity. Now the conversation is about whether they can pay their server bills. That's not a pivot, that's a complete inversion of purpose.
And let's be clear about who bears the risk here. If OpenAI's financial model collapses, the executives and early investors will likely be fine. They've already extracted enormous value. It's the later stage investors, the employees holding equity, and frankly the public, which has built workflows and businesses around these tools, that will be left holding the bag.
The broader implication for the AI industry is significant too. If the poster child of the AI boom can't figure out how to make money, it raises questions about the entire sector's valuations. We could be looking at an AI bubble that mirrors the dot-com era, massive hype, astronomical valuations, and then a painful correction when reality catches up with the promises.
Bottom line on OpenAI, the fundraising machine is sputtering. The debt is mounting. The competition is catching up. And the experts quoted by Al Jazeera are not optimistic about the path forward. This is a company at a crossroads, and which direction it goes will have enormous consequences, not just for investors, but for anyone who depends on AI technology.
Now let's shift from Silicon Valley to Seoul, because something genuinely remarkable is happening in South Korean politics. President Lee Jae-myung, who took office after the dramatic fall of former President Yoon Suk-yeol, is governing in a way that has no real precedent in South Korean history. And according to reporting from the Diplomat, South Koreans are responding with overwhelming approval.
Let's set the context here, because you can't understand what Lee is doing without understanding what came before. South Korea's presidency has historically been what scholars call an imperial presidency, highly centralized power, decision-making shrouded in secrecy, and a political culture where the president operates almost like a monarch. Every single former South Korean president has either been assassinated, imprisoned, or faced criminal investigation after leaving office. Every one.
That is an astonishing statistic that deserves repeating. Every former South Korean president has faced a catastrophic end to their political career. And the most recent case, Yoon Suk-yeol, was arguably the most dramatic of all. He literally declared martial law, tried to send troops to seize the National Assembly, and was eventually impeached and removed. The country was in genuine constitutional crisis.
So Lee Jae-myung steps into this wreckage and, according to the Diplomat's analysis, does something radical. He chooses transparency. Instead of retreating behind the walls of the Blue House and governing through backroom deals, he has made a deliberate choice to govern in the open. He's trading what the Diplomat calls imperial secrecy for radical transparency.
And let's talk about what that looks like in practice, because it's not just rhetoric. Lee has focused on what the Diplomat describes as tangible results, concrete, measurable outcomes that ordinary South Koreans can see and feel in their daily lives. This isn't about grand ideological projects or abstract policy debates. It's about delivering on specific promises and letting people verify the results for themselves.
The approval ratings reflect this approach. South Koreans, who have every reason to be cynical about their political leaders given the history we just described, are responding positively. And this is significant because Lee himself has a complicated political backstory. He faced criminal charges before taking office. The fact that the public is looking past that history and judging him on his current performance tells you something about how hungry people are for competent, transparent governance.
There's a deeper structural point here, Maya. What Lee is essentially doing is trying to break the cycle. South Korea has had this pattern for decades: concentrate power, govern in secrecy, inevitably face scandal or crisis, and then the whole system crashes and resets. Lee appears to be betting that if you remove the secrecy, if you distribute the power, if you focus on mundane but meaningful results, you can break that destructive pattern.
And this has implications far beyond South Korea. We live in an era where democratic institutions are under strain almost everywhere. Trust in government is at historic lows across the developed world. If Lee's model works, if transparent, results-oriented governance can actually sustain public support and avoid the corruption trap, that's a template other democracies should be studying very carefully.
But let's also be appropriately cautious here. It's early days. South Korean politics is notoriously volatile, and Lee faces enormous challenges: a hostile opposition, a powerful conservative establishment, and the structural economic pressures that affect all advanced economies. The question isn't just whether he can be transparent today, but whether that transparency can survive the inevitable crises that will test any presidency.
The Diplomat's analysis also highlights something important about the nature of democratic leadership. Lee is essentially arguing, through his actions rather than his words, that a president can be powerful without being imperial. That accountability and effectiveness aren't in tension with each other. That's a radical proposition, and if he can sustain it, it could fundamentally reshape how we think about executive power in democratic systems.
And the contrast with what came before couldn't be sharper. Yoon tried to seize absolute power and lost everything. Lee is deliberately giving power away, or at least making the exercise of power visible, and gaining public trust in return. There's a lesson in there that goes well beyond Korean politics.
Now let's turn to our third story, and this one is both heartbreaking and infuriating. We're going to Myanmar, where a corruption scandal has erupted inside the National Unity Government, the NUG, which is the umbrella resistance organization fighting against the military junta that seized power in the 2021 coup. The Diplomat is reporting on what's being called Pyar-Gate, and it's threatening to tear the resistance apart from the inside.
Let me frame why this matters so much. Since the military coup in February 2021, Myanmar has been in a state of civil war. The junta, led by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, has committed what the United Nations and multiple international bodies have described as atrocities against civilians, airstrikes on villages, mass detention, torture, and systematic destruction of communities. The resistance, a loose coalition of ethnic armed organizations, People's Defense Forces, and the NUG, has been fighting back, often with minimal resources and at enormous personal risk.
So when a corruption scandal hits the NUG, it's not just a political embarrassment. It's potentially existential. The NUG's legitimacy, its entire reason for being, rests on the claim that it represents a democratic alternative to military rule. If the people fighting and dying for that alternative discover that their own leaders are corrupt, it doesn't just damage morale. It undermines the fundamental moral case for the resistance.
According to the Diplomat's reporting, this is a high-profile corruption case that has drawn significant backlash within the resistance movement. The scandal involves allegations of financial misconduct within the NUG's leadership structures, and the reaction from both supporters and critics has been fierce.
What makes this even more complicated, and this is critical to understand, is that the scandal has also generated what the Diplomat describes as claims of divisive politics. In other words, some within the resistance are arguing that the corruption allegations are being weaponized, used not to clean house, but to settle political scores, marginalize certain factions, or advance particular ethnic or political agendas within the broader coalition.
And this is where it gets really dangerous, Maya. The Myanmar resistance is not a monolithic organization. It's a coalition of incredibly diverse groups, ethnic armies that have been fighting for autonomy for decades, newly formed People's Defense Forces made up of ordinary citizens who took up arms after the coup, exile politicians, activists, and diaspora communities. Holding that coalition together is already enormously difficult. A corruption scandal that creates factions and finger-pointing could fragment the entire movement.
Let's talk about who benefits from that fragmentation, because this is where investigative journalism has to ask the hard questions. Who benefits when the resistance is divided? The military junta. Full stop. Every internal conflict within the NUG, every scandal that divides supporters, every argument that pits one resistance faction against another, all of it serves the interests of the generals who seized power illegally and have been brutalizing the population ever since.
That doesn't mean we ignore corruption. Quite the opposite. If the NUG is serious about representing a democratic alternative, it has to hold itself to a higher standard than the junta. You cannot fight for democracy while practicing the same corruption and secrecy you claim to oppose. The people of Myanmar deserve better from their resistance leaders than, at least we're not as bad as the military.
But the manner in which corruption is addressed matters enormously. If the response is transparent investigation, accountability, and institutional reform, that actually strengthens the resistance by proving it can govern itself ethically. If the response is cover-ups, political purges, or weaponizing accusations for factional advantage, that's a death spiral that plays directly into the junta's hands.
There's also an international dimension here. The NUG depends heavily on support from the international community, from diaspora fundraising, from sympathetic governments, from humanitarian organizations. Corruption allegations make it harder to maintain that support. Donors and governments that are already hesitant to engage with what they see as a complicated civil war situation now have an additional reason to keep their distance.
And let's not forget the human cost. While these political dramas play out in NUG leadership circles, ordinary people in Myanmar are suffering. Millions have been displaced. Communities have been destroyed. People are dying. Every day that the resistance spends fighting itself instead of fighting the junta is a day that the people of Myanmar pay for with their lives and livelihoods.
The Diplomat's reporting suggests that how the NUG handles this crisis will be a defining moment for the resistance. If they can navigate it with transparency and accountability, they emerge stronger and more credible. If they can't, if this becomes a cycle of accusations, counter-accusations, and factional warfare, the consequences could be catastrophic for the entire democratic movement in Myanmar.
All right, Alex. We've covered 3 very different stories tonight: OpenAI's financial crisis, Lee Jae-myung's transparency experiment in South Korea, and the corruption scandal in Myanmar's resistance government. Now let's do what Truth Report does best. Let's connect the dots. Because there is a pattern here, and it's one that matters.
The thread that connects all 3 stories is this: the tension between transparency and accountability on one side, and concentrated power and secrecy on the other. Every one of these stories is fundamentally about that struggle. OpenAI concentrated power and decision-making in the hands of a few executives, operated with minimal transparency about its finances and governance, and now it's facing a reckoning. The bill is coming due, literally.
In South Korea, Lee Jae-myung looked at a system that had been defined by that same concentration of power and secrecy for decades, and saw that it destroyed every single leader who embraced it. So he's trying the opposite approach. Radical transparency. Distributed accountability. Tangible results over imperial mystique. It's too early to declare victory, but the early returns suggest the public is starving for exactly this kind of governance.
And in Myanmar, we see the most painful version of this dynamic. A resistance movement that was born out of opposition to the junta's absolute, unaccountable power is now facing its own internal test of accountability. Will the NUG practice what it preaches? Will it hold itself to the standards it demands of others? Or will it fall into the same patterns of secrecy, factional power plays, and institutional corruption that characterize the regime it's fighting against?
There's a lesson here that goes beyond any individual story. Whether we're talking about a tech company, a national government, or a revolutionary movement, the pattern is the same. When power concentrates and accountability disappears, failure follows. Sometimes it's financial failure, sometimes political collapse, sometimes moral catastrophe. But it follows. It always follows.
And here's the thing that should keep all of us awake at night: these patterns are not confined to faraway countries or billion-dollar companies. They play out in every institution, every organization, every community. The question is always the same: who has power, and who holds them accountable? When the answer to the second question is nobody, trouble is coming.
What we're also seeing across these stories is the cost of misplaced trust. Investors trusted OpenAI with hundreds of billions based on promises and hype rather than demonstrated profitability. South Koreans placed trust in a succession of imperial presidents who betrayed that trust every single time. And the people of Myanmar placed trust in a resistance government that may not have fully earned it. Trust without verification is just a polite word for gambling.
And that brings us to the role of journalism itself in all of this. The reason you're hearing about OpenAI's financial problems is because reporters dug into the numbers. The reason you know about Lee Jae-myung's governance experiment is because analysts at the Diplomat took the time to examine what's actually happening rather than relying on press releases. The reason you know about Pyar-Gate is because journalists are doing the dangerous, unglamorous work of holding a resistance government accountable even when it's politically inconvenient.
That's exactly right. Transparency doesn't happen by itself. Accountability doesn't happen by itself. Somebody has to ask the hard questions. Somebody has to follow the money. Somebody has to say, show me the evidence. And that's what we try to do here every single night.
So here's our call to action for tonight. Don't take anything at face value, not from a tech CEO promising a revolution, not from a politician promising reform, not from a resistance leader promising democracy. Demand evidence. Demand transparency. Demand accountability. And when institutions, whether corporations, governments, or movements, refuse to provide it, ask yourself why.
Follow the sources. We cited Al Jazeera and the Diplomat tonight because they're doing the kind of deep reporting that these stories demand. Seek out journalism that shows its work, that names its sources, that follows the money and the power. In a world drowning in hot takes and spin, rigorous reporting is the only thing standing between you and being manipulated.
That's our broadcast for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. The stories may change, the countries may change, the names may change, but the pattern never does. Power without accountability always fails. Always. The only question is how much damage it does before it falls.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Thank you for watching Truth Report. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and we'll see you next time. Good night.